Okay, welcome everybody. As I mentioned, we now have former Representative Devin Nunes on. Mr. Nunes will be speaking to us from the state of California. He's going to be addressing issues related to social media and its importance in elections, and also how social media is potentially manipulated either by government, by academia, or by the various technological companies. So, Mr. Nunes, we are very, very pleased to have you with us this afternoon. For us, we realize it's your morning, and welcome, sir.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. And following up with Dave Bossie, I mean, that's a tough act to follow. And I will say, I would have loved to have been there. But one of the reasons that I will not go to Paris is because one of our key partners, one of the key partners that True Social has in the free speech movement, is a company called Rumble. And many of you may not know this, but if you try to get onto a Rumble video in France, they will not let you get on there. So the government of France had made threats to Rumble, and Rumble said, okay, look, we're going to just close out. We're not going to play these games of trying to attack free speech. And so far, True Social does work in France, but yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. But I wanted to point that out, and of course, say hello to my good friend Dave Bossie. I think I'll look forward to taking questions from the audience, but just a couple of just kind of brief data points that I think are timely. The first is, let's take the situation it's now went global, but this mass murder that you had, one of the largest terrorist attacks, killing the most people in kind of the shortest amount of time in the most savage way that we saw on October 7th in Israel. Now, if you would have told me 15, 20 years ago that, someday in the near future that there would be a terrorist like that attack, number one, I wouldn't think it'd be possible for Hamas to be able to pull something like this off. But second, I would think that people around the globe would be united in that, this is just unacceptable in today's modern age. But instead, what's happened is that we're seeing currently, right now, we're seeing protests not only all over the world, but more protests than I could imagine I'd ever see here in the United States of America, and including ability to close down members of Congress's office, some of my former colleagues, members of the Senate. You saw the destruction, or so to speak, of I guess you would call it, graffiti and at the White House, I think just 2 or 3 days ago. And these protests continue. You saw a Jewish American was killed in Los Angeles by somebody with a megaphone. So this is happening globally. Now, why is that? There was an important poll that I saw just a couple weeks ago that I think is relevant to social media, and that is that kids between the ages of 18 and 25, over half of them thought or believe that Hamas was justified to carry out these attacks. Now, why did that happen? Now, I can only speculate, but I think it is an important point for everyone to understand the kind of the way that at least I view the social media landscape. Let's go through the different platforms you have of the major platforms. So you have Facebook owned by Meta now. Typically for the people that are over the age of 60. Yes, other people have Facebook accounts, and I'm talking specifically in the United States. I think Facebook is still bigger around the world. I think has a little bit of a younger audience around the world. But for the most part in the United States, it's over the age of 60. People use Facebook to keep up with their family. They don't want to get rid of their accounts. Then you take the next step down, which I would say would be Instagram. Instagram is like for the 25 to 50-year-old, maybe a little higher. Instagram has a massive audience. I think where Facebook is on the decline, Instagram is fully engaged, and I don't know how much they're growing in the United States, but for sure you see from the ages of 25 to up to 60. People are on Instagram a lot, and it's a platform that people get addicted to. Then under the age of 25 in the United States, you see TikTok. And those are the three, in my opinion, the three major platforms globally. Now you have Twitter, which is now called X. It's kind of got a narrow focus. It's really news and information. I would argue it's also an echo chamber for the left and the right to go in and fight with each other. It was utilized by the U.S. government as we've now found this out, and specifically the FBI, as a tool for the left to use to gather intelligence and carry out messages globally that the left wanted to push out, narratives that they wanted to build. But Twitter, for the most part, is, and I think as Elon Musk found out, it's a lot of bots. It does have a beautiful bird with the term tweet that Elon got rid of, that is global. So it is kind of that venue that people use to push out a message. I think it's better than it used to be, but it's not the platform that it should be, or that it could be. Many people ask, why did I left Congress at the height of my career. Right in the middle of my career, I had been chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I was poised to be chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And people say, why would you leave when you're getting ready to take over one of the most important committees in the United States Congress after dedicating all that time and energy? Well, the reason that I did that is pretty simple. It's that I was being suppressed and I had no way to get out of the box that I was in. So I was one of the first members of Congress to actually be shadow banned. I think I was the first member of Congress to be shadow banned where we actually caught the companies doing it. That happened in 2018 at the height of the Russia hoax hypocrisy where I was leading that investigation, where we had exposed the DNC, the Hillary Clinton campaign, the mainstream media, and the social media companies all participating in this hoax. Now, that happens, 2018, it gets worse in 2019, where at one point I was able to use those different venues, specifically Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, to push out some call it the counter narrative. I would call it actually the truth, the real narrative of what was happening. But over time, by the end of 18 and 19, I was having a real problem of getting my message out. To get around that, I started a podcast. I was one of the first members of Congress to start a podcast. I did it weekly. It was audio only. And the podcast really shot up, and I was using my email lists around the country and around the world. I'd email the podcast out, so much so that usually on the weekends, I would be in the top 10. Now, granted, back in those days, there weren't as many podcasts. Now, today, there's such a plethora, but I would do it once a week. On the weekends, my podcast would be towards the top. And I was using Facebook, et cetera, to do it. And this was in late 2019 into 2020. This podcast was really effective for me to communicate to my constituents in California, and also for me to carry a message, do great interviews with people and I was able to showcase different reporters, members of Congress, people who typically didn't get a large venue to express the work that they were doing. I could do it on my podcast. My podcast got so big at one point, I was able. Then I got onto this company called Parler, which was a startup free speech platform, very similar to Twitter. I was the first member of Congress onto that platform. And all of a sudden, I truly understood what suppression was all about. I knew that I was being shadow banned. I knew I was being suppressed. But all of a sudden on Parler, really a platform that nobody had ever heard of. And it seems like a long time ago, but this was in early 2020. Suddenly I was getting, within just a few months, specifically, I remember the time frame, it was right around July 4th, because Twitter and Facebook, Instagram were shadow banning so many Americans, kicking Americans off these platforms that they were, I call it the internet ghetto. They were basically being shoved into the internet ghetto. They had nowhere to go. And this was being led by the Democratic Party, working with the Department of Justice, ironically, that was under the Trump administration, and the FBI, which maybe we'll get into later, which is hopelessly corrupted. But by the July 4th of 2020, I am getting double, triple the audience and the interaction on Parler, remember, that nobody really knew of, than I was getting on all the other platforms. Now, keep in mind, I didn't just have like a few people on these platforms. I had, on Twitter, for example, I was well over a million people. I think between all my Facebook accounts, I was well over 500,000 people. And I was getting more on Parler, more interaction on Parler, where I think at that time I had maybe 500,000 followers on Parler. Well, I also then successfully used Parler to put my podcast out, and it continued to grow. Then along comes Dan Bongino, calls me and says, and who's a famous American podcaster now, one of the first to actually use that technology. He had been on Parler, or was on Parler, and then he calls me and says, "Hey, your podcast is doing really well. You really ought to put it on YouTube. You ought to do video and put this on YouTube." So I decided, okay, I'll put this on, we'll try it out. It was a lot of work. It's a lot harder to do video, especially, today after COVID and all the lockdowns, Zoom, this technology really, and Skype and others got to the point now where I can talk to you guys in Paris. It wasn't so easy back in 2020. And then to do audio, you could do it from almost anywhere. You could do it via phone. You could hook up. It wasn't a problem. Video there's a lot more to it. So I started doing a video podcast. My first video podcast on YouTube, I thought it did well. I got about 5,000 views. I was pushing it out to Parler and my other accounts, got about 5,000 views. I had no idea what was good or bad. But then the next week, I dropped down to like 700. And then the third week, I dropped down to like 100. Now, look, I have 100 friends and family just in my neighborhood and constituents that they would at least click play on YouTube just to make me feel good, so that at least I got a click. And in the same time, my audio podcast continued to increase, but my video podcast was basically where you couldn't even find it. And in fact, you would go to YouTube and you would type in, my podcast has a very unique name, very difficult. It was called, I'm being sarcastic here, but it was called the Devin Nunes podcast. So you could go to YouTube, type in Devin Nunes podcast, and nothing would come up. Matter of fact, the only thing that would come up were nasty fake news videos about me that would come up on YouTube. So finally, after just, I don't know, I think we did 5, 6, 7 episodes. I just said, look, this is enough. I said, let's just go I told my team, let's find a video player anywhere in the world that will work. That where we can just send it out. The links will work when we email it out. If we put it up on Parler, they'll work. Well, we found this company, it was a small video player company in Canada called Rumble. And so I was actually the first guy when I went to Rumble had just started going from a video player to then trying to break into the YouTube scene. And they started that with funny animal videos. So they were uploading funny animal videos, and they tried to get a little niche with funny animal videos. So it was funny animal videos and the Devin Nunes podcast. That was all of Rumble. And nobody had it on, nobody had the app, nobody was using Rumble in the United States. Well, long story short, I had about 10,000 followers on YouTube after being on there for many, many years. In 3 weeks, I had 35,000 followers on Rumble, a platform nobody had ever heard of. By election day of 2020, I had nearly 400,000 followers on Rumble, a platform that nobody had ever heard of. By that point, though, Dan Bongino and others figured that out, and pretty soon it became a haven. Rumble became a haven for people to go to, a safe zone for people to go to make sure that they weren't being censored by YouTube. Some people call it ScrewTube, but I won't go there since I'm trying to be professional CEO here of a social media company. Then I think the most horrific thing that's ever happened that doesn't get a lot of attention in U.S. history, and there's been a lot of bad things that have happened here in the United States in the last decade, but I will say I think the very worst thing that happened was when Parler after the 2020 election, so many people got banned off of Facebook, Instagram. And this is, a lot of people forget this. There were millions of people that were like immediately banned after election day. You know, I know people that had 1 million followers on YouTube that were completely nuked with no excuse. They didn't, no questions asked. You couldn't get a hold of anybody. People with 1 million followers on YouTube, how they were making their living, were suddenly wiped, obliterated from all of social media. Next came, and so that happens all after the election until finally, I think people in the country, around the country, realized, okay, Donald Trump's going to get kicked off of everything. Wow, where's he going to go to? He's going to have to go to YouTube. He's going to have to go to Rumble and Parler. And now the good thing is that Rumble was ready for this. Rumble had all of their internal networks. They had all their own servers. They couldn't be banned from the planet. Parler, however, and this is what I think is the worst thing that's ever happened. Parler, however, was of all the bad things that have happened here in the United States, Parler was, their services were cut by some almost 36 American companies, many of the largest companies in this country, and their services were annihilated. And that $1 billion company was wiped off the face of the planet. So now here I am in 2021 with no way to get my message out other than my podcast and Rumble, no way to reach the masses. And so I went around the country talking about it. Long story short, Donald Trump didn't have a platform either. He decides that he wants to build one. And then at the end of 2021, he called me up and said, hey, you know a lot about this. Would you leave Congress and come and start this company for me? So I left Congress at the beginning of 2022. We set out to build True Social, which is now, even today, it's the fastest growing social media company in history. Donald Trump has more followers on True Social today than he had on Twitter when he came down the escalators with Melania, what Corey and Dave Bossie were talking about earlier. Came down the escalator in Trump Tower in New York City. He has more followers on True Social today, and that's despite the everyday bombardment of all the fake news saying that how bad True Social sucks. But despite all that, this is a flourishing platform, and what really pisses all them off is we're global and we can't be shut down. So, and that because we're working closely with Rumble, we're on their cloud, we ride on those rails, so to speak, and we built all of our code internal, so there's no outside company that can shut us down. So that's kind of my background. That's why I left Congress, and I'm sure we can get into some Q&A here. But I think what you're seeing today with TikTok and their ability to manipulate people around the globe, especially with this crisis going on in the Middle East, I think you see it really. I think you're starting to see it. I don't have any evidence of this. This is just anecdotal evidence, but I think TikTok is really moving young people around the world to essentially take a horrific terrorist attack and have it be justified by what they're seeing on TikTok. But anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all, and hopefully, if you don't do it in Paris next year, if you do it in a country that's more free, I'd love to be there in person.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Devin Nunes. It was a pleasure having you call in and address the audience here in Paris.